The history of Europe is one of shifting borders, fragmented states, and a constant struggle for power. Among the many actors on the stage of this drama, one kingdom played a pivotal role in the unification of what would eventually become modern Germany. This kingdom, however, no longer exists in the form that once defined its borders and influence. This was Prussia, a nation that for centuries sat at the heart of Europe's most defining historical events. While modern-day Germany owes much of its existence to the events of the 19th and early 20th centuries, its roots are deeply embedded in the rise of Prussia, without which Germany's unification might have been a much different, if not impossible, reality. Prussia's origins stretch far back into the depths of prehistory. The early ancestors of the Prussians were part of the Baltic branch of the Indo-European language family. These tribes began to settle the area that would later be called Prussia, long before the major migration periods that reshaped Europe. The people who would become known as the Prussians inhabited what is now northern Poland, the Kaliningrad region of Russia, and parts of Lithuania. Early mentions of these tribes, under various names, appear in ancient texts. The Roman historian Tacitus was one of the first to document them in his writings, referring to them as the Asti. The term Prussians began to appear in historical chronicles around the 12th century. Although its exact origin remains elusive, it is likely, however, that it was a self-designation, a name the Prussians used to define themselves, though the precise meaning and origin of the word are still debated. The Prussians remained fiercely independent for a long time, resisting conquest by their neighbors. They were not, however, an organized state, but rather a collection of tribal societies. These tribes, despite facing frequent raids from Germanic, Slavic, and Lithuanian peoples, did not form a unified kingdom or empire. Their lack of centralized governance and administrative infrastructure prevented them from forming a fully cohesive state. Instead, the Prussians lived a traditional tribal life, similar to many other early European peoples. Their society was agrarian, with agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting, and fishing forming the backbone of their economy. They built simple wooden houses, often surrounded by defensive ramparts or ditches to protect against attacks. Their economy was primarily based on grain cultivation, livestock farming, especially horse breeding, and the trade of amber, a valuable resource in the region. Their daily lives were governed by tribal elders and military leaders who wielded significant influence over the people. The Prussians often formed temporary alliances with neighboring tribes, either to defend their territories or to conduct raids against enemies. However, without a centralized army or regular armed forces, their territories were vulnerable to more organized and militarily advanced neighbors. In battle, the Prussians used simple weapons, such as spears, axes, and bows, and their armor was made of lightweight leather or fabric. The Prussian language, a member of the Baltic group, was closely related to modern Latvian and Lithuanian. Sadly, the Prussian language disappeared entirely over time, gradually replaced by German due to the process of Germanization and cultural assimilation. Old Prussian knowledge survives through a few written records, but the language, like much of the Prussian culture, faded into history. Before their eventual Christianization, The Prussians practiced paganism, worshipping a pantheon of deities that reflected their close relationship with nature. Palo, the god of death and the underworld, was one of their chief gods, alongside Punas, the god of thunder and lightning, and Potpo, the god of the seas and crops. The Prussians revered sacred trees, springs, and stones, and their priests, called vitilotus, performed religious ceremonies at sacred sites. One of the most significant places of worship was the sacred grove of Ramavi, where a shrine to the supreme god was said to be located. The connection the Prussians had with the natural world was not merely symbolic, but deeply ingrained in their way of life. Their pagan beliefs shaped their understanding of the world around them, leading to a profound reverence for the land, the waters, and the sky. The sacred groves were not just places of ritual, but they were considered the very heart of Prussian spirituality. Trees were seen as living beings, with their roots reaching down to the underworld, while their branches touched the heavens. The springs and rivers were sources of life, embodying the purity of the divine. The vitilotus, as keepers of this sacred knowledge, held immense power and influence, ensuring that the Prussians remained connected to the gods. Unlike the grand temples and monumental structures built by other ancient cultures, the Prussians did not need buildings to house their gods. Instead, they built their sacred spaces within the natural world, constructing simple altars and offering sites at the bases of trees or beside rivers where they could commune directly with the divine. These sites were scattered across the Prussian landscape, and each held its own unique significance, making their spirituality deeply rooted in the land they inhabited. The vitilotus were highly respected, not just for their knowledge of the spiritual world, but also for their ability to heal and perform rituals that ensured prosperity and protection for their people. As the centuries passed, the Prussians found themselves increasingly pressured by their neighbors. The Slavic, German, and Lithuanian peoples all posed significant threats to the Prussian way of life. The world around them was rapidly changing. Where once the Prussians had lived in isolation, the growth of surrounding kingdoms and the expansion of foreign influences led to more frequent invasions. The surrounding peoples recognized the rich resources of the Prussian lands. And with the rise of powerful kingdoms like Poland and the emergence of more aggressive neighbors, the Prussians could not maintain their autonomy forever. This period marked the beginning of a series of invasions and conflicts that would eventually shape the Prussian narrative. In the early Middle Ages, the Prussians frequently raided the lands of their neighbors and faced retaliatory attacks in turn. The Prussians had developed a warrior culture that was accustomed to fighting against outside forces, and their raids were often successful. Their strikes against Slavic tribes to the south and east were particularly effective, allowing them to assert their dominance over the region. These raids were not only acts of aggression, but were also an essential part of their survival strategy. They helped secure the resources needed for their agrarian economy and provided opportunities to expand their trade networks. One of the most notable aspects of Prussian society during this time was their ability to engage in both warfare and commerce. Despite their lack of a centralized state, the Prussians were able to establish important trade routes and develop centers of commerce. One of the earliest examples of this was the establishment of the trade and craft center of Trousseau in the late 9th century. It's located at the center of the Nagat River. Near modern-day Elblag, Trousseau became a key center of the Prussian economy, attracting merchants from across Europe who traded amber, grain, and other valuable goods. It was a place where culture, craft, and commerce intersected, and it served as a vital connection between the Prussian lands and the broader world. Trousseau's strategic location allowed it to thrive as a trading hub, but its prosperity also made it a target for raiders. In the late 9th century, Viking attacks led to the destruction of Trousseau, marking one of the Prussian people's greatest setbacks. The Vikings, known for their seafaring prowess, repeatedly targeted the coastal settlements of the Prussians, including Trousseau. The destruction of this vital center was a blow not only to the Prussian economy, but also to their sense of security. The Prussians, despite their martial prowess and ability to resist other invaders, were unable to defend their coastal settlements against the Vikings. This loss underscored the vulnerability of the Prussian way of life and set the stage for further challenges in the centuries to come. By the late 10th century, the Prussian lands had been successfully invaded by the Rus under the leadership of Voltaire, the first Syatlowicz, and by the Poles under Mieszko I, the Rus, seeking to expand their influence in the northwest, conducted military campaigns against the Prussians, while Mieszko I, the ruler of Poland, sought to increase Polish territory by conquering pagan lands to the northeast. The expansionist ambitions of both the Rus and the Poles posed a significant threat to the Prussian people, who had long maintained their independence through a combination of guerrilla warfare and strategic alliances with neighboring tribes. The Prussians, despite their decentralized nature, resisted these invasions with great determination. They used their knowledge of the terrain and their skills in guerrilla warfare to fight back against the Rus and the Poles. However, the constant pressure from multiple fronts eventually wore down the Prussian defenses. The raids and invasions grew more frequent, and the Prussians found themselves facing enemies who were better organized and more militarily advanced. This was a time of great uncertainty for the Prussians, as their way of life was under a constant threat of annihilation. Simultaneously, the Prussians regularly launched raids into Polish lands, further complicating relations between the two peoples. These raids were not just acts of aggression, but also defensive maneuvers in response to the growing pressure from surrounding kingdoms. The Prussians, still fiercely independent, saw the encroaching forces as existential threats to their way of life. Over the following decades, both sides continued to clash, with the Prussians fighting to retain their independence and the Poles and Rus seeking to expand their territory. Despite these tensions, the Prussians never succeeded in forming a fully centralized state, although they did manage to organize more effectively and gain access to modern weaponry through trade. The Prussians' decentralized nature and their reliance on guerrilla tactics meant that they were difficult to conquer. However, their vulnerability became apparent in 1226, when Polish Duke Conrad of Mazovia invited the Teutonic Order, a military religious order, to wage war against the Prussians. Conrad's decision was based on the Teutonic Order's reputation as a powerful military force, but he greatly miscalculated their intentions. Initially, the order was invited to help defend Polish lands from Prussian raids. But over time, the Teutonic Knights would become a force so powerful that they would change the Prussian landscape forever. The Teutonic Knights were originally founded during the Third Crusade in the late 12th century to provide care for sick and wounded pilgrims in the Holy Land. However, over time, the order transformed into a military force, and its knights, monks, and priests became trained warriors, dedicated to expanding Christian influence in the Baltic region. They were, at first, a humble religious group, but their mission soon became one of conquest and territorial expansion. Their central role as a military order made them the ideal tool for Duke Conrad, who was struggling to combat the growing power of the Prussians. Duke Conrad's miscalculation lay in his assumption that the Teutonic Knights would not establish deep roots in the region. He believed that, being foreigners, they would eventually become dependent on him, and would not pose a long-term threat to his own control. However, the Teutonic Knights, under the leadership of Grand Master Hermann von Salza, had much grander ambitions. Rather than merely assisting Conrad, they took advantage of the opportunity to claim land for themselves, making it clear that they were there to stay. In the early stages of the Teutonic conquest, the order established its first strongholds in Prussia, including castles like Thorn and Marienburg. These fortresses were not only military outposts, but also served as administrative centers, where the knights began to impose their authority over the local population. The Teutonic Knights were skilled in siege warfare, and their military discipline and organizational strength allowed them to take Prussian lands quickly. They relied on their military superiority to control large swaths of the Prussian territories, often forcibly converting the local population to Christianity. However, the Prussians did not surrender easily. Despite being a decentralized society, they fiercely resisted the foreign invaders. The Prussians, who had lived in their ancestral lands for centuries, were unwilling to accept foreign rule. They employed guerrilla tactics, striking at the Teutonic Knights' vulnerable supply lines and ambushing their forces in the dense forests. The Prussians knew their land better than any invader, and used this advantage to wage a long, drawn-out campaign of resistance. At first, the Prussians were successful in several battles, inflicting significant casualties on the Teutonic forces. Their determination and knowledge of the terrain allowed them to harass the knights and prevent their complete conquest. The Prussian warriors, led by tribal chieftains and military leaders, fought with unparalleled ferocity. Knowing that their survival depended on pushing back the Teutonic Order, for many years, the Prussians managed to keep the knights at bay, though the Teutonic Order continued to press its military campaigns with increasing intensity. During this time, the Prussians began forming alliances with other neighboring peoples who were also threatened by the Teutonic Knights' expansionist policies. One notable alliance was with the Lithuanians, who were themselves engaged in a struggle against the Teutonic Order. The Lithuanians, like the Prussians, resisted Christianization and sought to maintain their independence. The Prussian-Lithuanian alliance was not without its challenges, but it allowed both groups to combine their resources and coordinate their resistance against the knights. Despite these efforts, the Prussians could not halt the relentless advance of the Teutonic Knights. The knights, were well supplied and well funded, receiving support from the Pope, who saw the conquest of Prussia as part of the broader Christian mission in the Baltic. Over time, the Teutonic Knights managed to strengthen their positions, constructing more castles and fortifications to secure their control over the region. The relentless expansion of the Teutonic state led to the gradual erosion of Prussian autonomy. The Prussian resistance, though fierce, could not match the disciplined and well-organized military force of the Knights. In 1260, the Prussians launched the Great Uprising, one of the most significant rebellions in their history. This revolt was organized under the leadership of Hircus Montanus, a nobleman who had received an education in Germany. Hircus sought to use his knowledge of Teutonic military tactics and organization to organize a more coordinated resistance. Key was a charismatic leader, and his efforts to unite the Prussian tribes against the Teutonic Knights gained considerable support. The Great Prussian Uprising began in the summer of 1260, and for a time it was successful in pushing the Teutonic Knights back. Hircus Montanus led his forces in several raids against the Teutonic castles, employing guerrilla tactics that had proven so successful in earlier conflicts. The Prussians also gained some assistance from neighboring Lithuanians, who sent troops to aid in the uprising. Together, they inflicted significant damage on the Teutonic Order's military infrastructure. However, despite the initial successes, the uprising ultimately failed. The Teutonic Knights, with their superior resources and manpower, were able to regroup and launch a counteroffensive. The Prussians, unable to maintain their momentum, were eventually crushed by the overwhelming power of the Teutonic military. Hircus Montanus, despite his best efforts, was unable to rally the Prussians to a final victory. In 1274, the Teutonic Knights crushed the last vestiges of the Great Uprising, and the Prussian lands were effectively secured under their control. With the fall of the Prussian resistance, the Teutonic Knights imposed their rule over the region. The Prussians were forced to convert to Christianity, and their lands were colonized by German settlers. The once proud and independent Prussian tribes gradually assimilated into German culture. By the 14th century, the Prussian language had disappeared, and the Prussians, as a distinct ethnic group, had ceased to exist. The Prussian identity, however, lived on in the land itself, in the cities and fortresses that the Teutonic Knights had built, and in the archaeological remains that continued to tell the story of a people who fought for their homeland. The Teutonic Knights, having conquered Prussia, were now firmly entrenched in the region. They built their state upon the lands of the Prussians, and the Prussian struggle for independence became a distant memory. The Teutonic Order, with its disciplined and fanatical military, would continue to shape the future of the region for centuries to come. But the Prussians' legacy would remain carved into the land, their courage immortalized in the annals of history. The Teutonic Order, now the rulers of Prussia, continued their expansionist policies, eventually coming into conflict with Poland, Lithuania, and the Grand Duchy of Ruthenia. The Knights' most significant military engagement came in 1410 with the Battle of Grunwald. This epic battle, one of the largest in medieval Europe, saw a combined Polish-Lithuanian army defeat the Teutonic Order, breaking its power in the region. The battle marked the beginning of the decline of the Teutonic Order's influence in the Baltic region. And over the next few centuries, the order's territories were gradually eroded by internal strife, economic troubles, and wars with neighboring states. The Battle of Grunwald, fought on July 15, 1410, was a decisive turning point. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance, under the command of King Władysław II Jagiello and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania, faced off against the Teutonic Knights, led by Grand Master Ulrich von Jungien. The battle was the culmination of decades of conflict between the Teutonic Order and the various Slavic and Baltic tribes, as well as Poland and Lithuania. Jagiello and Vytautas united their forces, which included Polish, Lithuanian, and Ruthenian troops, to confront the Knights, who were well trained and equipped with the latest military technology. The Battle of Grunwald was fought on a broad, open field, and the Knights were initially confident that their heavy cavalry would overpower the lighter forces of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. The Teutonic Order's army was made up of about 27,000 men, including knights, mercenaries, and levies from controlled territories. The Polish-Lithuanian army, numbering around 39,000, was diverse, comprising Polish knights, Lithuanian light cavalry, and mercenaries from neighboring regions. The Knights attempted to break the lines of the Polish-Lithuanian forces with a direct assault, but the battle did not unfold as they had planned. Early in the battle, the Teutonic Knights advanced with their heavy cavalry, hoping to overwhelm the Polish forces with a massive charge. However, the Polish-Lithuanian forces employed clever tactics. The Lithuanian forces, led by Vytautas, feigned a retreat, luring the Teutonic Knights into a trap. This diversion allowed the Lithuanian and Polish cavalry to flank the Knights and strike their exposed sides. The battle became chaotic, and the Teutonic Knights' lines began to crumble. The turning point came when the Polish-Lithuanian forces broke through the Teutonic center, and the Knights, unable to regroup, were routed. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungien, the leader of the Teutonic Order, was killed during the battle, shattering the morale of his forces. The Knights attempted to retreat, but they were pursued and slaughtered by the Polish and Lithuanian troops. The defeat was devastating for the Teutonic Order, with thousands of knights and soldiers killed, including many of their elite warriors. The battle dealt a crushing blow to the Knights' authority and severely weakened their military power in the region. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance emerged as the dominant force in the region, while the Teutonic Order's influence waned. The victory was not just a military triumph. It also symbolized the growing unity between Poland and Lithuania, which would eventually lead to the establishment of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For the Teutonic Knights, the loss at Grunwald marked the beginning of the end. Over the following decades, their power in the Baltic region continued to decline, and they were unable to recover the territories they had lost. Despite this, the Teutonic Order still held some territories, and its influence persisted for several more years. The defeat at Grunwald was followed by the Peace of Toru in 1411, which, although it formally ended the war, did not restore the Teutonic Order's former power. The Knights were forced to pay a heavy tribute to Poland and cede some territories, but they retained control over key lands. However, internal divisions within the order combined with economic difficulties, left it increasingly vulnerable to further challenges. The Teutonic Order's decline continued throughout the 15th century. In 1466, the Prussian cities and nobility, dissatisfied with the heavy taxes and centralized control of the Teutonic Order, revolted and sought support from Poland. This led to the 13 Years' War, 1454 to 1466, during which the Prussians, supported by Polish forces, once again fought for their independence. The conflict resulted in the Treaty of Toru, 1466, which further weakened the Teutonic Order. Under the treaty, the western part of Prussia, known as Royal Prussia, became a part of the Kingdom of Poland, while the eastern part, known as the Duchy of Prussia, remained under the control of the Teutonic Order, though it became a vassal state of Poland. The Treaty of Toru not only marked the decline of the Teutonic Order, but also laid the foundations for the rise of a new political entity in the region, the Duchy of Prussia. In 1525, the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Albert of Brandenburg-Gansbach, secularized the Order's holdings and transformed the Teutonic state into a Protestant duchy under the sovereignty of the Polish king. This act of secularization was confirmed by the Treaty of Cogman in the same year. Albert, who was a relative of the Polish king, became the first Duke of Prussia, effectively ending the Teutonic Order as a military-religious organization, and marking the beginning of the Duchy of Prussia as a secular state. The establishment of the Duchy of Prussia set the stage for the eventual rise of Prussia as a powerful European state. The Hohenzollern family, which had risen to prominence in Brandenburg, now controlled the Duchy of Prussia, and they would later go on to unite it with the Electorate of Brandenburg to form the Kingdom of Prussia. Under the rule of the Hohenzollerns, Prussia would go on to become one of Europe's most formidable military and political powers. The fall of the Teutonic Order marked the end of an era in the Baltic region, but the legacy of Prussia, though transformed, lived on. The lands that had once been the stronghold of the Teutonic Knights would eventually become the heart of a powerful German state, and the military traditions established by the Teutonic Order would continue to influence Prussia's military and political strategy for centuries. The events of the 15th century, and especially the Battle of Grunwald, played a crucial role in shaping the future of Eastern Europe, and they set the stage for the rise of Prussia as a major player on the world stage.